They say America is built on forgotten graves, on silent foundations buried so deep beneath history and progress and the constant noise of civilization that no one remembers what was first laid in the dirt, before the railways, before the factories, before the parades and presidents and patriotic stories that make school children smile and pledge allegiance without knowing what that silence really cost. Because sometimes, when the wind moves just right through the broken husks of long abandoned buildings or slips under a cracked cellar door that's been sealed since before your grandfather was born, there are sounds that don't belong to the present, whispers, that carry the weight of children who never got to grow old. And somewhere in the brutal heart of Illinois, about 30 miles northwest of what we now call Springfield, there's a stretch of dead land where the wind still doesn't blow right, and the grass never grows evenly. And if you listen long enough, if you're quiet enough and still enough, you just might hear it too, the echo of that summer in 1812 when 45 children died, not from illness or accident or any known force of nature, but from something colder, darker, and far more calculated than any epidemic or natural disaster could ever be. For nearly 2 centuries, this story never made it into textbooks or journals or documentaries. Not because it wasn't known, because it was briefly, before it was buried like everything else that doesn't serve the national memory, but because what happened at the Riverside Children's Home in that cursed summer didn't fit the moral script of frontier hardship and American virtue that people needed to believe in, especially in the early days of westward expansion, when everything was raw and desperate and barely held together by hope and blood and the thin illusion of Christian order. No, what happened there wasn't a story of pioneers or missionaries or heroes. It was a quiet genocide, a methodical unmaking of young lives conducted under the banner of discipline and survival by a man whose name should be carved in stone alongside history's worst monsters, but instead was left to rot in forgotten records. His crimes hidden behind polite words like unorthodox administration and charitable experimentation, while the children he starved, froze, and broke one by one were recorded only as numbers, case files, failed subjects in a system that was never meant to protect them, only to mold them into something unrecognizable or leave them buried beneath the frost-bitten earth. The Riverside Children's Home, at first glance, had been nothing more than a remote frontier orphanage, an institution set up in 1806 by the Illinois Territorial Charitable Society to house children whose parents had been killed by disease, conflict, or the raw misfortune of trying to survive on the bleeding edge of American expansion. For 5 years it had operated quietly and effectively under the care of Mrs. Ella Lanena Hartwell, a Massachusetts widow whose own children had died of scarlet fever, a woman who had dedicated herself to turning that institution into something safe and warm amidst the snow-choked loneliness of the Illinois wilderness, a place where lost children could be taught, fed, and slowly prepared for the long, hard road of life beyond the walls that held them. But in November of 1811, she died alone at her desk during the first frost of a winter that climatologists would later call the year without a summer, a freak stretch of environmental chaos that saw rivers frozen until May, crops dead before they could bloom, livestock dropping dead in the barns and fields, and entire communities pushed past the edge of starvation and collapse. And in that moment, with Mrs. Hartwell gone and no one else willing to take her place, the society made a single, desperate decision that would come to stain that land with a darkness so thick that even the roots of trees refused to grow near. The foundation in the decades that followed, they appointed Josiah Crane, a decorated militia officer with no experience in education, no training in child welfare, and no warmth left in his soul after years of brutal warfare along the frontier. A man whose private writings and battlefield reports would later reveal an obsession, not with protection or compassion, but with what he called survival refinement, the belief that only through extreme physical and emotional hardship could the human spirit be purified and strengthened, that softness was not a flaw but a disease, and that the American future depended not on comfort or kindness, but on breeding a generation of citizens who could endure pain without flinching, starvation without begging, and death without fear. But none of this was known in 1811, not to the territorial authorities desperate for a replacement, not to the staff that resigned quietly in the weeks after Crane took charge, and certainly not to the 47 children left behind in that limestone building by the Sangamon River, who had already survived the trauma of losing their families, only to be handed over to a man who saw them not as wounded souls, but as raw material to be hammered into shape or discarded like flawed iron because, for Crane, those children were not individuals with needs or dreams or fears. They were tools to be tested, soldiers to be forged, vessels to be emptied and refilled with something cold and unbreakable. The details of what happened next, the hunger, the cold, the punishments, the deaths would not be known until the spring of 1987, when a crew of state-funded contractors, hired to assess the structural integrity of the long-abandoned riverside building before it was slated for demolition, uncovered a sealed root cellar hidden beneath the west wing, and inside that cellar, beyond the rusted iron door and the rows of frost-scarred wooden beams, they found a locked iron strongbox containing dozens of leather-bound journals, medical logs, and coded administrative documents, all written in Crane's unmistakable hand, each page a precise and clinical record of every experiment conducted between December 1811 and June 1812, from his initial fitness assessments to the final refinements he imposed before the state finally intervened and removed the 12 barely living children that remained. Those 12 survivors, if they could still be called that, were found in late August of 1812, when a delayed inspection team, prompted by unanswered correspondence and rumors from nearby settlers, finally arrived to discover a silent building, filled with the stench of rot and candle wax, where the children, hollow-eyed and half-naked, sat huddled in the main hall, unable to speak or even look directly at the men who tried to pull them from the darkness they had been forced to live in for 8 months of unrelenting cruelty. And though the official records from that inspection were brief and incomplete, many pages redacted or lost in the years that followed, one line has survived, scrawled in the margins of a magistrate's personal notes, a phrase so chilling that even the state archivist who rediscovered it in the 1960s chose not to speak it aloud during his retirement interviews. A line written with such finality that no one who has read it has ever been quite the same again. Methods employed beyond Christian comprehension. For decades, that phrase was the only real clue that something had gone terribly, irredeemably wrong at Riverside. A linguistic artifact of a horror too vast to describe directly, a shorthand for the kind of moral collapse that leaves no survivors. Only witnesses too broken to remember clearly or speak without trembling, and so the building was left alone, untouched by settlers, avoided by travelers, whispered about by children in nearby towns as a place where ghosts lived, and eventually reclaimed by weeds, rot, and silence until it vanished from maps entirely. A smear of history deliberately ignored because it couldn't be explained, because it didn't fit the myth of American progress or benevolence, because it asked a question no one wanted to answer. What happens when the people entrusted to protect the innocent become the architects of their destruction? By the time the documents were made public in 1990, after years of legal battles with the State Historical Society and intense resistance from several powerful local institutions with ties to the old territorial government, the story had already begun to spread, not through official channels or government press releases, but through underground forums, university back channels, and private collections passed from scholar to scholar like cursed relics, until finally pieces of the story began appearing in signs, independent documentaries, and now here, in the only format we can safely share without triggering automatic takedowns from the platforms. Still too cautious to touch it directly. So if you're hearing this, if these words have reached you in your home, your car, your headphones, wherever you've allowed yourself to listen past the noise of ordinary life, we need you to know that this isn't just a story, it's a reckoning. A mirror held up to the parts of history we were told not to look at, the parts that reveal what happens when discipline becomes ideology, when children become experiments, and when silence becomes complicity. If you've made it this far, leave a comment, tell us what state or city you're listening from. Not because we want your data, but because these lost stories deserve witnesses. And the further these words travel, the harder they become to bury again, and what you're about. To hear in the coming chapters will change the way you look at institutions, at power, at childhood, and at the comforting lies we've all been taught to believe about who we are as a nation and what we are willing to sacrifice in the name of strength. Because the story of Riverside didn't end in 1812, it was just hidden. Like all dangerous truths are, until someone was foolish enough or brave enough to dig it up. And once you know what happened there, once you've seen what Crane did in the name of survival, you'll never look at discipline, education, or authority the same way again. The winter had come like a punishment, not from the sky, but from somewhere deeper, something older and crueler than weather, a force that did not simply chill the bones, but reached into the memory of the land itself, and erased anything that had once been warm or forgiving or alive. And by the time the first snow fell in the early days of November, it was already too late for the people who lived in the Illinois Territory to prepare, because this was not just a season, it was an event, a collapse, a cold so complete, it felt like the end of something ancient and the beginning of something monstrous, and long before anyone gave it a name, long before scientists labeled it, the year without a summer. Those who survived it already knew it for what it was, a trial, a reckoning, a winter that did not wait for permission to take what it wanted. The rivers froze fast and deep, so that even the ice broke with a sound like bone. The animals either fled or died in their stalls, and barns became tombs for livestock too weak to cry out, while men with cracked hands chopped at the earth with rusted tools, hoping to reach water that no longer moved beneath the surface, and women watched their children sleep in layers of cloth in prayer, afraid to wake them in case they did not stir. And yet still the snow came, still the frost thickened, still the sun refused to warm the world, and by the time December arrived, it was clear that this was not just another harsh year, but something else entirely, something biblical in its scope and silent in its cruelty. And there in the midst of it, like a forgotten house of paper in a storm, sat the Riverside Children's Home, its limestone walls strong, its beams groaning, its chimneys spilling weak tendrils of smoke into a sky that had long since stopped caring about smoke or warmth or mercy. And inside it 47 children waited for something to return, something to resume, something to be fixed. Because they did not know yet what had changed, only that Mrs. Hartwell was gone, and the routine that had once given shape to their days had unraveled like thread in a cold wind, and everything that had once made them feel human seemed to be disappearing, one small ritual at a time. No more warm bread in the morning, no more firelit stories before sleep, no more songs sung softly through the halls by a woman who had once held every one of their names in her hands like they were something sacred and irreplaceable. Only silence now, only instructions, only the rhythmic pacing of boots on stone floors, and a voice like iron and gravel calling roll at dawn and again at dusk, not to count, but to account for, and the man behind the voice, Josiah. Crane did not look like the kind of man who should be running a home for children, and perhaps that was the point. Perhaps the men who arrive when no one else will are the ones no one should ever have called. He came with no family, no belongings, no softness, only a satchel of papers sealed with red wax, a pistol worn at his hip, and a notebook that he opened every hour as though he expected the pages to instruct him, and he looked at the children, not as people, but as specimens, not with cruelty, but with a distant calculating interest, as if their presence was a problem, and he was a man who had solved many problems with discipline, silence, and fear. And when he spoke, it was not loud, but it did not need to be, because there was something in his tone that suggested the volume of his voice did not reflect the severity of his consequences. The children did not know the world had shifted. They did not yet understand that the warmth they had once known had not simply died with the seasons, but had been taken from them, deliberately excised as part of a plan written in secret and sealed, with the same cold logic that had guided Crane's military campaigns, and while others mourned the loss of food or animals or familiar comforts. Crane looked upon the failing world with a kind of hunger, a kind of opportunity, because where others saw crisis, he saw a crucible, and Riverside was to become his forge. What no one knew, not the society that appointed him, not the clerks who signed his commission, not the passing traders or distant priests who still prayed for the children's souls from pulpits far away, was that Josiah Crane had come to believe that the world itself had become diseased with softness, that modern life with its prayers and comforts and sentimental attachments had made the human spirit weak and therefore expendable, and that only through trial, through pain, through carefully measured deprivation, could a new generation of humans be built strong enough to inherit the world that was coming. He had seen it, he said, in the wilderness. He had seen it in the snow, in the faces of dying soldiers, in the eyes of children left orphaned by raids and disease. He had watched men beg for water and watched children carry their own dead brothers in their arms through burned villages, and he had concluded that the difference between those who lived and those who died was not luck or providence or even strength, but preparation, the willingness to suffer with purpose, the ability to remain unmoved by suffering. And if the world would be cold, then so must its children be colder. So as the rivers froze and the sun vanished behind a sky of ash, Josiah Crane began to rebuild the children of Riverside, not as students, not as wards, not even as souls, but as instruments, as bodies to be honed and measured and shaped. And the cold outside became an extension of the cold within, because Crane did not fight the winter, he welcomed it. He opened the windows and let the wind howl through the dormitories. He rationed food according to his assessments of discipline. He removed all symbols of comfort, blankets, rugs, songs, prayers, and in their place he installed what he called observation, structure, consequence. The observation was constant and silent. The structure was rigid and daily. The consequences were incremental and escalating. And though the children did not yet understand what was happening, they felt it. They felt it in the way their fingers burned in the morning, and the way their stomachs ached when they tried to sleep, and the way their memories of warmth began to feel like dreams of another life. And through it all, Crane wrote in his notebooks, marking each child not by name but by number, by performance, by tolerance. And when one boy collapsed from fatigue, Crane noted only a deviation from expected stamina curve and adjusted the metrics for others accordingly. Outside, the world suffered and froze. Inside Riverside, the suffering was designed, refined, and given purpose. And what happened over those weeks was not chaos, but order, a new kind of order, one not seen before or since. And yet it felt inevitable, as if this was always meant to be, this cold, this silence, this shaping of children into something other than human. One of the boys, Samuel Harrison, would later recall that it felt like time stopped, not metaphorically, but literally, that days bled into each other without meaning, that snow became sky and sky became wall, and wall became breath, and breath became pain, and pain became the only thing that connected them to anything real. And when the snow came through the cracks in the window, they did not brush it away. They let it fall on them like ash from a fire they could no longer see. But what the children could not see, and what the outside world never would, was that the winter itself had become an accomplice, that the silence of the land, the isolation of the territory, the absence of oversight, had created the perfect conditions for something unholy to be born, and it was not a demon, not a beast, not a ghost, but something worse, something human, something methodical. And when the documents were uncovered in 1987, and the transcripts of Crane's personal logs were read by historians and forensic psychologists, alike there was a collective pause, a silence, not unlike the one that had choked the halls of Riverside, because what they read was not madness, not the ravings of a lunatic, but a carefully documented sequence of trials designed to measure the human threshold for suffering. One passage in particular, written during the third week of February, would become the most quoted, the most feared. It read, "As cold is constant. Hunger is predictable, fear is manageable, love is a contaminant. Eliminate it early and outcomes improve." Significantly, and in those words, there was no rage, no poetry, no sign of guilt or even doubt, only the logic of a man who believed that children were clay and pain was fire, and that the shape he made would save the world. What Crane did not know, what he could not predict, was that even in the deepest cold, even in the most calculated environment of fear, something else was growing, something he could not measure or suppress or break, and it began as a whisper among the children, a look, a shared piece of bread, a song hummed beneath the breath, and it would take months to become anything like resistance. But it was there in February, buried beneath the snow and the bones and the cold, and it would not die even when the children did. But that is for later. Now we return to the winter, to the sound of footsteps on stone, to the hollow voices of children saying yes, sir, to a man who never heard them as anything more than echoes of his own belief, and the land around them did nothing to stop him, because the rivers were frozen and the trees were still, and God, it seemed, had turned his face away. Or perhaps Crane had never believed. He was watching it all. What do you remember when the world goes cold? Asterisk. What do you hold on to when the air itself becomes your enemy? And what does it mean when the only man who feeds you believes pain is a gift? There was a time when Riverside was not a place of silence, or starvation, or winter-haunted screams buried beneath limestone walls, but rather a name whispered with modest pride in the homes and parlors of distant villages, a testament to the idea that the frontier could contain not just brutality and hunger and godless land, but also care, also order, also mercy. And in that brief window between 1806 and 1811, the Riverside Children's Home stood as proof that even among frost and uncertainty and the permanent ache of Western expansion, some effort was being made to preserve childhood, not as an indulgence, but as a birthright. The home itself had been commissioned with the sober ambition of the Illinois Territorial Charitable Society, a name that suggested generosity, but functioned more often as a mechanism of containment for those deemed too fragile, too costly, too inconvenient for the world their parents had failed to survive. And yet, despite the cynical origins of its funding and the indifferent bureaucracy that approved its creation, Riverside thrived under the leadership of a woman whose own tragedies had rendered her immune to sentimentality, and yet full of compassion. Her name was Elenina Hartwell, and though no statue bears her likeness, and no school children recite her name in memorized histories, the records make it clear that without her the deaths would have started years earlier. She had come from Massachusetts wrapped in widow's weeds, her hands still trembling from the fresh burial of her own children taken by scarlet fever. And though the journey west had not been kind, though the riverboats and roads and bone-deep cold had offered her no welcome, she arrived in 1806 with a strength that defied both expectation and biology. And when she first walked the halls of Riverside, it was not yet finished, the walls not yet plastered, the chimneys still cold, the bunks still empty, and yet she looked upon it not as a building, but as a vow. She had no family left, but she would build one. Here, even if every child arrived broken, silent, and angry. The early years were hard, not because of discipline or rebellion or cruelty, but because the world itself refused to cooperate. Storms came without warning, crops failed, the river flooded, disease crept through the dormitories like a whisper. And still she stayed still. She worked from dawn to exhaustion, sewing, mending, teaching, comforting, writing careful letters to distant tradesmen and farmers, seeking placements for children who had no names before they arrived and who might die unnamed if no one intervened. And slowly the home filled with sound, with laughter, with aching sobs in the night, with the rustling of papers and the rhythms of structured life. And by 1810 the ledger showed something remarkable. Of the 127 children who had passed through her doors, 119 had left again, not in coffins, but in carts, on foot, in the arms of new families, or the aprons of tradesmen willing to teach them something useful and maybe even decent. The 8 who died were mourned, properly marked, and recorded, not lost or erased, and even their deaths felt like part of the cost of trying to bring warmth to a place that had known too much cold. And in those years there are no reports of beatings, no unexplained injuries, no sudden silences, and the inspectors from Springfield wrote reports filled with words like stable and satisfactory and humane, and that word humane appears more than once underlined in the cursive of men who rarely cared for underlining anything, and it is perhaps that word more than any other that vanished when Mrs. Hartwell died. Her death was not violent, not visible, not scandalous, but it was the start of something, and like all starts, it was misread as an ending she had worked. Late again, a habit she had never broken, bent over her records like candlelight wrapped in 3 shawls because her room never fully held the heat, and in the morning she was found with her head still resting on the ledger, her pen clutched in one hand, and her tea long since gone cold. She had died of what the coroner called an apoplexy, a phrase that meant very little to the children, but everything to the bureaucrats, because it meant natural, it meant unavoidable, it meant the state owed no one anything. They buried her in the frozen soil, behind the home next to the creek that sometimes ran clear in the spring, and sometimes didn't run at all. And though the ground was hard, and the sky offered no grace, the children stood still for her and wept. The kind of weeping that is not loud but hollow, not brief, but permanently etched into the body like a second kind of aging. And when she was gone, the home changed, not all at once, not like a falling tree, but like a roof that begins to sag and rot, unseen, until one night it simply collapses, and there is nothing left to do but run from the rain or drown where you sit. The Territorial Charitable Society did not send a replacement. Immediately they debated it. In letters they argued about funding. They weighed candidates, none of whom were particularly eager to winter in a limestone orphanage 30 miles from anything resembling comfort, and the delay grew into weeks, and the weeks into hunger and confusion. And still the children remained in that building. Still the fires were lit. Still the older ones tried to enforce the old routines, because Mrs. Hartwell had taught them that routine mattered, that meals should be served on time, that beds should be made, that a song before sleep was not foolish but protective. And even as the meat ran low and the snow piled against the windows, they truly tried. It is difficult to understand the damage done in those weeks, not by violence, not by cold, but by absence, because the absence of care is its own kind of brutality. And the younger children began to lose weight, not just from lack of food, but from lack of meaning. They stopped speaking in full sentences. They clung to older siblings or invented ones and asked when she would return, and no one had the heart to answer, and so they said nothing, and in that silence something else arrived, something far colder than snow. His name was Crane, and his arrival was sudden and without ceremony, and though he was offered as a solution, he was in truth the beginning of a new problem, one that would unfold not just in days or weeks, but in scars and graves and documents so horrific that they would be hidden for generations behind brick and steel and lies. And when he stepped across the threshold of Riverside for the first time in mid-December of 1811, the temperature outside was 31 below, and the river had frozen so solid that even the wolves were silent, and it was into that stillness that he came dragging one leg his face, unreadable, his papers in order, and his mind already filled with numbers and hypotheses, and cold, hard theories about children, and suffering and strength. He was appointed not because he was good, but because he was willing, and that willingness was interpreted as virtue by men who had never walked the halls of Riverside, and who never would, and by the time the ink dried on his commission, he was already en route, already planning, already discarding the language of care, and replacing it with the language of reform, of fitness, of protocols, of testing. And when he arrived, he did not ask for names. He asked for ages, heights, weights, prior illnesses, levels. Of obedience, he lined them up and wrote down everything except the color of their eyes and the shape of their tears, because those details did not matter to him and never would. The children sensed immediately that something had changed, not just in leadership, but in the very air of the place. Something sharp had been introduced, something that did not care whether they lived or died, only whether they followed instructions. And he began that first week not with comfort, not with transition, but with reclassification. He divided them into groups. He gave them new names, not names of affection, but of designation. And from that point forward, no child would ever again hear their full names spoken with kindness within those walls. What had once been a sanctuary had become a laboratory, and they were not students or wards or children, but subjects. And over the following months, what happened to them was not accident or negligence, but intention. And if Mrs. Hartwell's grave froze undisturbed through that winter, her memory did not. Her memory became a ghost, a rumor, a word that brought tears. If whispered in punishment, if overheard, and in time even that was lost, buried not by snow, but by protocol, by pain, by the methodical dismantling of everything she had built. And somewhere in the attic of that house, beneath dust and paper and age, there remained a single note she had written weeks before her death, a list of supplies to be requested in spring, and beside it a single sentence scrawled in hurried pen: "We must never become indifferent to their suffering." It was the last thing she ever wrote. And when they found it in 1987, it had been chewed by rats, stained with moisture, and almost unreadable. But the sentence remained, and the men who read it wept, not just because of what it said, but because of what came after, because what came after was Josiah Crane. He arrived without ceremony, without escort, without warmth, a man of 42 years, who bore more resemblance to winter itself than to any human being those children had known. And though the snow had softened the sound of hooves as the cart creaked down the narrow path toward the Riverside children's home, nothing softened the air around him, nothing warmed the space he entered, and from the moment Josiah Crane stepped through the door, the temperature within that limestone building seemed to drop another degree, not by weather, but by something deeper, colder, something of the soul. His records were impeccable, too impeccable, perhaps, a fact which should have raised concern. But desperation has a way of silencing good questions and exalting poor answers. And so the society, buried in correspondence and suffering under the weight of too many problems and too few solutions, did not pause long enough to notice the red flags in Crane's past, the campaigns where no survivors were left to testify, the letters of commendation that read more like clinical notes on animal behavior, the subtle but unmistakable pattern of his presence where others had vanished. He had served in the militia, yes, and that part was true, had marched and bled and buried comrades in snow and soil alike, had endured a 6-week entrapment in hostile territory during the campaign of 1809, an event officially labeled as a logistical failure, but unofficially whispered about in taverns and garrisons as something else entirely. A test of endurance that broke men's minds faster than it froze their limbs. And Josiah Crane had not. Broken, not visibly, not loudly, but something had come apart in him. Something silent and permanent, like a floorboard that seems stable until it's too late to step back. He spoke little of that winter, but when he did, it was with the same coldness he brought to Riverside, as if every starvation, every frost-bitten toe, every night spent huddled in a pit dug through permafrost was a parable, a lesson, a proof. That comfort was poison and suffering a kind of divine selection, and the few who knew him after his discharge noted that he had become obsessed with what he termed survival discipline, a philosophy so rigid and inhuman that even his fellow officers distanced themselves, saying little, but avoiding his gaze as though it might crack them open. When he presented himself to the charitable society, he did so with clarity, with conviction, with an almost clerical precision, speaking not of love or care or protection, but of order, of necessity, of discipline through deprivation. And though the language was cloaked in terms like character development and frontier preparedness, the heart of it was plain to any who bothered to listen, that he believed children were soft, that softness was failure, and that failure must be purged by fire or by frost or by force. He came bearing a leather-bound journal already half-filled, notes and diagrams and exercises and calculated thresholds for pain and endurance. And in it were words that should have disqualified him from any role involving children. Phrases like optimal tolerance zones and emotional resistance calibration and strength through induced suffering. But no one read them. Not then, not until decades later, and by then it was far too late. The blood long dried, the cries long silenced, the truth long buried beneath layers of polite forgetting. On December 15th, 1811, he was handed the keys to Riverside, not with fanfare but with relief, as though the building itself had become a weight that needed discarding. And so they gave it to him, to a man who viewed children not as wards, but as material, not as lives to nurture, but as bodies to refine. And when he arrived, he did not pause to assess, to mourn, to understand the loss of Mrs. Hartwell. He simply began, as though he had been waiting for this moment all his life, as though the winter itself had opened its jaws and asked for his guidance. The children met him in the main hall, still adorned with pine garlands from a Christmas no one would celebrate, still echoing faintly with the memory of songs no one had sung since Hartwell's passing. And they stood in rows, their woolen coats too thin, their eyes too wide, and they looked at him with the hope only orphans know, the hope that perhaps this stranger might be kind, might see them, might say their names with gentleness, instead of number them like livestock. But he did not see them, not truly. He saw only variables, subjects, data points waiting to be sorted and broken and rebuilt into something hard and useful. And when he spoke, his voice was dry and sharp, not raised but firm, and it cut through the silence like a bayonet. You have been made weak by comfort, he said. You have been fed when hungry, warmed when cold, sheltered from the truths of the world, and this kindness has ruined you. He divided them that same day, not by family or temperament or need, but by what he termed survival potential, a cold metric defined by age, weight, physical response to command, and a subjective evaluation he called grit presence, which meant nothing to the children but everything to him, and so they were grouped accordingly, the youngest labeled as developing strength, the Middle Ages as building resilience, and the oldest, the ones who had begun to understand that the world does not always protect its young, or called proving readiness. He explained none of this to them, offered no context, only tasks, instructions, rules, and punishments. And when he walked through the corridors that night, his footsteps slow and even, the children pulled their blankets tighter not from cold, but from dread, for they sensed already what he would confirm in the weeks to come, that under his care there would be no care at all. The fireplaces burned lower, the meals grew smaller, the routines shifted from education to endurance, and the silence became something denser, heavier, something that pressed down upon the children's chests as they tried to sleep, their minds, haunted not by nightmares, but by the very real certainty that the man now watching over them believed their pain was a gift, and that to spare them from it would be a sin. He wrote in his log that night, the first of many entries, each marked with the same title, Subject Progress Report, and beneath it he noted the number of children, their approximate weights, signs of mental softness, and a list of modifications to be implemented immediately, including caloric reduction, exposure trials, and physical compliance drills, and in the margin, a single phrase underlined twice, begin transformation protocol at once. What began that winter was not an experiment in education, but a campaign of conversion, not of belief, but of biology, an attempt to strip from children every softness, every instinct for comfort or connection, and replace it with something else, something colder, something more permanent. And though the snow would melt, and the rivers would thaw, and the sun would rise again come spring, the darkness that had entered Riverside, that December would not leave, not for months, not for years, not even for generations. Because Crane did not simply intend to strengthen the children, he intended to change them, fundamentally and irreversibly, to make them into creatures suited not for the world as it was, but for the world as he believed it should be, a world of scarcity and obedience and necessary cruelty, and in doing so, he would destroy something essential, something sacred, something that no doctrine or discipline could ever replace once broken. And though the walls remained the same, though the limestone did not crack, though the rooms did not burn, the building itself changed in character, in spirit, became no longer a home but a crucible, no longer a refuge but a forge, and the children, once voices in the hall, became whispers, and then echoes, and then finally silence. He did not sleep in the room assigned to him, did not hang his coat in the hallway, or place his boots neatly beneath the bed like the others before him. He moved instead into the root cellar beneath the building, a place once used for storing preserves and vegetables, now emptied and cold, lined with stone so thick no sound could escape, and there he set up a table, a chair, 3 oil lamps, and a collection of journals wrapped in waxed cloth, some filled with notes, others blank, waiting for what he called data entries, though no one else would ever see them, at least not while breath still filled the children's lungs. He told no one of this move. No staff remained to object. No visitors came to question his choices. And so he descended each night into that windowless chamber, where he wrote by lamplight, recorded details no sane man would prioritize, the number of steps each child took before collapsing, the duration of voluntary silence after a punishment, the consistency of tears shed under duress, and always, always, the phrase survival indicator trending negative or positive, as though they were animals in a cage being weighed not in pounds or inches, but in capacity for submission. Above, the building settled into a rhythm of decay. Meals shrank, voices quieted, and the children began to forget their names, or rather, began to forget why names mattered. For Crane stopped using them altogether, assigned each child a number, etched in ink on a linen tag worn around the neck, a number that replaced every whispered bedtime story, every memory of a mother's call across a field, every letter once sent by a father now buried beneath frost. He referred to them in his logbook not as boys and girls, but as assets, as resources, and he began drafting charts, columns, diagrams, mapping their psychological erosion like an engineer tracing the wear on a machine. And as winter deepened, and the walls groaned with cold, the numbers in his ledger began to vanish, not erased, simply replaced with a final notation, failure of will, subject removed. He did not bury them. he did not grieve. He recorded, cleaned, and replaced the blankets, and the next morning stood in the same hallway with the same calm eyes and repeated the same phrase: "The world outside will not wait for your readiness. So we must prepare you now." It was then he began the sessions. He called them drills, but they bore no resemblance to exercise. They were performed alone in the cellar, and began always with a child summoned after dark, a rope placed in their hand, an instruction whispered into their ear, sometimes to knot it and untie it until the skin bled, sometimes to stand on a stool and repeat the words "I am strong" until the voice cracked, sometimes simply to remain awake until dawn without moving, and those who failed were not beaten, they were ignored, and the silence that followed their return was worse than any pain, because they knew then that he had marked them, that the number on their tag now leaned toward removal. What no one knew, not even Mary Patterson, who saw more than most, was that beneath the cellar was another space. It had not existed when Mrs. Hartwell ran the home, not in any plans or records, but it existed now. Crane had dug it himself. A second chamber, smaller, carved from the frozen earth with stolen tools and concealed behind a false wall of crates, and within it a chair, restraints, a heavy ledger locked with iron, and a single question painted across the stone wall in lampblack: "Do you know what you are?" No child was taken there in the beginning, not until February, not until the deaths could no longer be hidden beneath the term exhaustion, not until he deemed the ordinary methods insufficient. The first child taken was Subject 11, a boy of 10 with a cleft lip and the remnants of a stutter. No family, no history, just a face half forgotten by the others, until he was gone, and then remembered with a sudden clarity that came too late. He was returned 2 days later, eyes wide, mouth closed, arms marked with thin horizontal lines that did not bleed but oozed, and he spoke only once to Mary when she asked what had happened, and his answer, no voice, only the drawing of a spiral on the floor with his finger, round and round, faster and faster, until he began to weep without sound. Crane wrote of the event with pride. Subject 11 responded favorably to concentrated exposure. Stress metrics increased. Compliance probability improved. He began to rotate children through the hidden room. Never the same pattern, never the same instructions, but always the same result: silence afterward, eyes that no longer met others, and behaviors that shifted toward what Crane described as ideal conformity. He measured it in terms of latency, the time between command and obedience. Mary noticed it in their breathing, shallower, quieter, the way they began to flinch not at touch but at kindness, as though the memory of warmth had become more painful than the presence of cruelty. He implemented what he called Phase 2 of the survival protocol. Labor conditioning. Children aged 5 and up were required to perform tasks for 10 hours per day, without gloves, without proper boots, hauling buckets of river water through snow, chopping firewood with rusted axes, scrubbing floors until their fingers cracked open. And when one asked why, the answer was simple: because weakness is a lie we cannot afford. There were no sick days, no rest, only evaluation, punishment, repeat. One morning a boy collapsed in the hallway, blood in his vomit, breath wheezing, and when Mary ran to help him, Crane pulled her aside and said, "He is proving something today. Let him finish." The boy died an hour later, and his blanket was washed and given to another. Mary began to write at night. Tiny scraps of cloth hidden beneath the mattress. Not letters, not confessions, but records. Numbers, names, dates, and a single question repeated over and over: if he is not human, what is he? Because by then she had begun to suspect something that no child should ever have to consider, that their pain was not a byproduct of his beliefs, but the point that suffering was not a mistake in the system, but the system itself. And beneath it all, In that chamber of cold earth and locked doors, Crane continued his entries. Continued to write of metrics, of tolerance, of thresholds reached and surpassed. And in one entry, dated March 3rd, a sentence unlike any other. Before it, the transformation curve aligns with predictions. Subject group demonstrates favorable adaptive behaviors. Spiritual resistance diminishing across all cohorts. Next phase may commence. And beneath that, a single line, written in darker ink. The experiment is now viable. The door opened that morning without the usual creak, and the man they had only seen in glimpses finally stepped forward with the silence of someone who no longer believed in explanation, only demonstration. And as he entered the main hall where the children stood uncertain and hollow-eyed, he did not speak, he did not smile, he simply looked, a long look, the kind of look that you feel more in your spine than your skin. And then he lifted a small leather-bound book, opened to a page already marked with red, and motioned for the children to form a line without saying a single word, and somehow they obeyed, without resistance, without question, because already something in them had begun to rot from fear, from the cold, from the sheer absence of kindness. And when they stood shoulder to shoulder in that hall, he finally spoke. Not with a shout, but with the flat tone of a man used to being obeyed, and what he said was not a greeting, not a welcome, but a command that shattered whatever memory they had of comfort. He said, "Today, we begin to assess your capacity. You will be separated by potential. You will be ranked by resilience. You will be trained according to the strength of your will, not your age, not your height, not your name, because names are for the soft and the civilized. And from this moment you are no longer names. You are subjects in training, tools to be forged, and if you break, you will be discarded, not mourned, not remembered, only recorded and replaced." And so began what he called the assessment of fitness, a cold phrase for what followed, which was not testing but slow, clinical cruelty. The children were made to stand barefoot on the stone floor for hours at a time, the smallest among them trembling violently as the frost seeped through their soles and into their bones. But the man only watched, recording reactions, noting how long each could stand before collapsing, and when they fell, he did not help them. He simply wrote down numbers, times, body language, and when one girl wept quietly, he stopped the assessment entirely, walked over, knelt to her eye level, and asked, "Why are you crying? Are you in pain?" And when she nodded, he whispered, then, "You have failed already," and ordered 2 boys to carry her out of the room. No one ever saw her again. Her bed was cleared that night. Her name was scraped off her storage box. And the next morning, a new number appeared where her name had been, and from that day forward, none of the children ever cried again, not in front of him, not in front of each other, not even in the dark when they were alone. He divided them into 3 groups, not by age or size, but by what he called survival signature. Group 1 was called developing strength, Group 2 building resilience, Group 3 proving readiness. The youngest were placed in the first group regardless of age if they showed what he called passive resistance. The middle group was subjected to cold exposure drills and food reduction, while the third group, the oldest and strongest, were given authority, red cloth bands to wear on their arms, and the right to discipline the others under his supervision. And this was when things shifted from cruelty to perversion, because he had begun to infect the children with his ideology, to turn them against each other, to make obedience not just a necessity, but a weapon. And when one child was caught sharing bread, he was not punished by the man, but by 2 boys in red bands who had once been his friends, and the man watched them deliver the punishment with crossed arms and an expression of cold pride. He was molding them into enforcers, and they did not resist because they were warm and fed and rewarded for cruelty with praise and privilege. And so the children began to compete not for comfort or affection, but for insulation from pain. And this is how morality died in that place. Not all at once, but slowly, replaced by calculation, by suspicion, by hunger-driven betrayal. A girl named Lila, who had once braided another's hair in the dormitory, now stood at the head of the line, reading infractions aloud with mechanical calm. And the one being punished was the same girl who used to whistle to calm the others during storms, Mary, who had dared to comfort a coughing boy with half her dinner. And for that kindness she was sentenced to cellar isolation, which meant 4 days in darkness below the foundation, where the air did not move, where the walls dripped with old water, and the only company was your own breath, and the occasional skitter of something unseen. And when she returned, she was no longer Mary. She was Subject 42, and she no longer spoke, she no longer smiled, she no longer reached out when others wept in their sleep, because the part of her that responded to human feeling had frozen, not metaphorically, but literally, and the man had noted it in his book with the phrase subject exhibiting appropriate dissociation, progress commendable, which was the highest. Praise he gave, and after that day all names were taken, and the children referred to each other only by number. And if one of them slipped and said a name, even by accident, they were given 24 hours of silence, during which they could not speak, could not ask for food, could not scream if they were hurt. And so the names faded, not just in speech, but in memory, and one boy asked once what his mother looked like, and no one could remember. Or if they did, they refused to say, because memory was weakness, and weakness was death. And the man wrote that phrase everywhere, on walls, on utensils, carved into the wooden door frames. Weakness invites death, and that was no longer a warning. It was law. And as January deepened, and the cold became something not external, but internal, something that lived in their blood, their teeth, their thoughts, another girl died during a midnight exercise. She had slipped on the ice, struck her head, and was unconscious by the time they dragged her inside. And the man said nothing, offered no treatment, simply marked her file with the words natural. Deselection, process refining, and the next morning her blanket was folded and placed at the foot of another bed, and her shoes reassigned, and her file added to a locked box marked archived. And when someone whispered her name in the hall, the whisperer was given 2 days of silence and 3 hours standing barefoot in the snow, and no one ever said her name again. And in this way the children learned to erase each other before the man had to do it for them. And even among themselves they no longer trusted, no longer asked, no longer hoped, because now they knew that hope was bait, that kindness was a test, that love was a trap set by the man to identify the weakest. And the ones who broke first were not the youngest, but the ones who remembered too much, the ones who still longed for warmth and light and forgiveness. And he called them emotional failures, and said they must be corrected or called. And so he began the correction phase, which will be written next, if you are ready to go deeper into the truth that no record was ever meant to preserve, and no sane mind was ever meant to endure. The floor had begun to feel like bone beneath their feet, not cold stone, not even frozen earth, but bone, dry and unyielding and listening. And by the time the sun returned for more than an hour a day, their eyes had grown dull from dimness, and their skin no longer flinched at the lash of wind across the threshold. And that was when he began what he called the real shaping. No more introductions, no more categorizations, only suffering arranged in methods and metrics, structured by an unholy precision that he never once questioned, never once softened. And he no longer used their numbers for discipline, only for record-keeping, because by now he had achieved what he called baseline emotional nullification, and that meant they were ready for phase 1, not the beginning, but the beginning of something worse. And phase 1 began with hunger, not absence of food, but strategic deprivation, the kind that twisted the stomach into hallucination and turned dreams into memories of warmth that were never real to begin with. Their single daily meal was cut. to a bowl of gray broth that smelled of burnt wheat and iron, and a piece of bread hard enough to cut the roof of the mouth if chewed too fast, which was often, because they were always hungry now, not the kind of hunger that gnaws, but the kind that becomes identity, the kind that makes a child look at another child's fingers and wonder how they might taste, and he recorded their behavior with a soldier's detachment, noting signs of what he called adaptation thresholds, such as reduced verbal complaint, diminished eye contact, increased sleep hallucinations, and absence of voluntary touch, which he considered the highest form of progress, and when they shivered, he praised them. When they bled, he wrote. When they collapsed, he stepped over them with the calm of a gardener pruning weak shoots from a dying vine. The dormitories were stripped of extra blankets, only one thin cover per child, and the fireplaces were left unlit, save for a single ember that smoked, but gave no heat, and they were forbidden from huddling together at night, which meant the dark itself became an instrument of the program, not emptiness, but pressure, the kind that crushes the chest and makes breathing feel like treason. And even in sleep they were watched, because he would come at night without warning, walking the halls with a lantern that cast long shadows against the limestone walls, checking their posture, their stillness, their dreams, for any signs of regression. And those found speaking in their sleep were woken and made to stand in the courtyard barefoot until their lips turned blue, because even the unconscious mind had to be disciplined. And it was during these long nights that the first visions began, not dreams but shared hallucinations, whispers of figures standing at the windows, faces without eyes staring from the juring attic vents, and one boy swore he heard something breathing behind the fireplace stones. Not wind, not rats, something larger, something waiting. And when he told the others, he was taken that night and returned the next morning with blood on his collar and no memory of anything. And he never spoke again, not once, not even to eat. He simply opened his mouth when food was offered and closed it when it was done. And so they stopped speaking of the things they saw, not because they didn't believe, but because belief became dangerous. And when belief is punished, it turns inward. And so the children carried their madness like extra weight, like a second spine curling beneath their skin. And the man, who now wrote with both ink and what appeared to be a thin smear of rust along the page margins, began carving new symbols into the walls, strange intersecting lines, circles within, squares, shapes that made the eye ache when looked at too long. And he said nothing about them, not once. But the children began to notice they appeared closest to the dormitories where the deaths had occurred. And one girl, who could read a little from her time with Mrs. Hartwell, claimed one of the symbols meant forgetting. But when she said that aloud, her tongue swelled that night for no reason anyone could explain, and she choked on her own breath and died before morning. And he recorded it as natural cause, subject unfit, failure of biological resilience, and the other children marked that spot on the floor in silence, not with words, but with footsteps, always avoiding it, even when sleepwalking, and none of them spoke again about what things might mean, because meaning itself had become poisonous. And the worst part was that they were changing, not just physically, though their bodies had shrunk, into wire and bone and shadow, but inside they no longer flinched at screams, no longer cried when a name was erased, no longer waited for mercy. They simply followed, ate, stood, obeyed, not because they feared him, but because they no longer remembered how not to. And this was what he had wanted, a clearing of the old mind, the birth of a new will. And in his journal, he wrote that progress toward stage 2 had exceeded expectations, and that psychological dependence was now irreversible in all but 4 subjects, and that those 4 would be corrected or culled before the equinox. And among those 4 was Mary, who had begun speaking again, but only to herself, speaking names not aloud, but with her fingers scratched into the frost on the windows. And Samuel, who had started hoarding bits of bread not for himself, but for others. And Lila, who watched the man too closely, who studied his movements, his pauses, his silences. And the last was Thomas, a boy who had once forgotten his own name, but now whispered it to himself at night, like a weapon. And he, the man, had noticed and written each name beside the word fracture risk. And so began the secret war beneath the silence, a war of stolen glances and whispered guilt, of smuggled crumbs and brief touches in the dark, a war not for escape, but for the preservation of something invisible, some small fire that refused to go out. And that was when the cellar door opened, not metaphorically, not as a threat, but physically. Its iron lock scraped open, and the man called 3 numbers to come forward, and the others watched as the door swallowed them whole. And the cold that followed from that stairwell was not natural, not air, but something else, something that tasted like metal and mold and old skin. And when the children returned, they did not speak, not because they had been punished, but because they had seen something that no longer made words possible. And the man smiled for the first time in weeks, not wide, not mad, just satisfied, and said, "We are ready for true endurance now." And the children understood that everything before had been preparation, and what came next would be worse than death. It would be the death of self, and that would be Section 8. Shall I continue without pause, without gaps, only the truth as it bleeds and freezes and stares back without? Eyes? The sky was pale and sickly that morning, a thin stretch of gray that offered no light, no warmth, no memory of blue. And the children stood lined in rows with their heads lowered, their breath rising like fog from corpses still warm. And he walked between them with his hands behind his back, glancing now and then at a clipboard that held no paper, only the weight of what he had seen and what he still planned to do. And then without warning he spoke, not with volume, but with finality, and said the phrase that would mark the beginning of the real descent, the point beyond which none would return. He said the phrase calmly and without pause, and it was this: the training has failed one among you, and that failure must serve as instruction to the rest. And before the sentence had fully sunk in, he had pointed toward a boy no older than 6, a child named Thomas Brennan, whose only mistake had been to cough too often in the morning and cry too quietly at night. And the man ordered him forward, and Thomas stepped out with bare feet that cracked and bled in the frost. And the man told him to remove his coat, and Thomas did so slowly, his hands trembling as if resisting some unseen pull. And then he was told to walk to the center of the courtyard and remain there without movement until permitted to return. And the others, frozen in their own fear, watched as he obeyed, taking slow steps toward the middle of the stone yard where no warmth reached and no mercy dwelled. And there he stood, his eyes wide and unfocused, his chest rising and falling in fast, shallow gasps. And the wind picked up then, a low animal howl that came from the direction of the river, and it seemed to carry with it a voice or many voices, not loud but layered like breath on glass. And still the man gave no command to end the exercise, and the minutes passed like centuries. And then Thomas fell, first to his knees, then forward into the snow. And even as his body spasmed, the man did not move, not until Mary Patterson screamed, not a cry of fear, but of defiance, a sharp and cutting sound that split the air and made every child turn in unison. And she ran to him, to Thomas, ignoring the orders, ignoring the pain in her legs, ignoring the death that waited in silence. And she reached him and tried to lift his head. And only then did the man step forward and shout enough, his voice loud now, harsh and breaking. And he dragged Mary away by her arms, threw her against the stone wall, and ordered the others to return to their places. And then he knelt beside the boy, placed 2 fingers to his neck, and stood up slowly, turning toward the house with his lips pressed tight in a line. And he said, "The child has expired. Not he died, not he passed, but expired, like something used and emptied. And in his journal that night, he wrote the words "Subject T. Brennan demonstrated insufficient will to overcome physical discomfort. Death confirms inadequate preparation. Remaining subjects must be strengthened to prevent similar failures." And the children read it with their eyes, because he left the pages where they could see them, though he never said that aloud. And that was the beginning of the real terror, because it was the first time one of them had died from the training. Not illness, not accident, but from what he now called exposure therapy, and it made something shift inside them. Not a break, but a rearrangement, like bones healing wrong, like silence learning to scream inward. And from that day on, the courtyard was no longer just a place to suffer, but a place where ghosts began to gather. Small, barefoot, voiceless ghosts, who stood where Thomas had fallen and waited for someone else to join them. And though none of the children spoke of this openly, they all began to walk differently near that spot, slower, heavier, as if stepping through memory too thick to ignore. And in the nights that followed, Mary was locked in the storage room with only a bucket of water and no blanket, and the others heard her whispering to herself, whispering names, and one night she whispered not only names of the living but of the dead, including some none of them had spoken since the early days. And that was when Samuel began keeping a journal, not with ink, but with bits of coal stolen from the fireplace, scratched into the undersides of bed frames, the backs of cabinets, the stone behind the water basin, recording what he called the falling, the slow erasure of everything they had known. And in one entry, he wrote, "We are being made into something else, not survivors, but reflections, mirrors." For a man who no longer sees himself in anything living. And during this time, the man began carrying a new book, not the journal he used before, but a black one bound in hide, stitched by hand and with no title. And when he wrote in it, he used a red ink that smelled faintly of copper and rot, and he never let it leave his room. And on the nights he wrote most fervently, the house grew colder, not by temperature but by presence, a feeling like something watching from the roof beams or the fireplace cracks, something waiting. And Emma Caldwell began to speak in her sleep again, speaking in a voice that was not her own. And when the others tried to wake her, she only stared, wide-eyed, not seeing them, and whispered, "He's opening the lower door. He's opening it from the inside." And that was the first time any of them heard the phrase lower door, and they didn't know what it meant, but they began to feel its weight, as if there was something beneath them, under the floor, older than the building, older than any of them. And when the man next gathered them for morning instruction, he had a wound on his left hand that looked not fresh but ancient. And when asked about it, he said it was from a ceremony, not punishment, and then said no more. And from that day forward, the cellar was referred to in the logs as the sanctum. And those sent there no longer returned the same, not physically altered, but restructured in thought and obedience. And Samuel wrote that the boy named Elias, who had been laughing just the week before, came back from the sanctum without his laugh, without his voice, and without the space behind his eyes. And he simply stood when told and sat when ordered, and stared when nothing was happening. And Elias was the second to die, but no one could say how. Only that he was found in the hallway with no wound, no blood, only stillness. And the man said it was a failure of nerve integrity, but the children knew better. They knew it was the sanctum, and that, whatever had been opened down, there was no longer content with whispers. It wanted form, it wanted breath, it wanted more Thomas Brennans and more Elias specters to walk the snow in silence. And that was when Samuel found the first page from the black book, torn and tucked under the broken leg of a chair, and on it was written a passage that none of them understood, but all of them felt. It said the soul is soft clay until tried by discipline, and then shattered by trial. What remains is not human but obedient. And Mary whispered after reading it that this was not a home, not a school, not even a prison. It was a forge. and they were being burned to remove everything but the shape he wanted to see. And that shape had no voice, no will, no heart, only hands that moved when ordered, and eyes that saw only what they were told. And in that moment they knew Thomas had not died alone, because something had waited to welcome him, and it was still waiting for the rest. Shall I continue into section 9, where obedience becomes identity and resistance begins to rot from the inside? She no longer cried, not when the frost bit her fingertips, not when the sounds in the cellar moved like water through the stone walls, not even when she heard the name Thomas whispered just behind her ear, though no one stood there. Mary Patterson simply sat each night in the corner of the dormitory, with her knees pulled to her chest and her eyes open wide, never blinking for long, never speaking unless directly addressed. And even then her answers were short, measured, and mechanical, like someone trying to remember what it meant to be human. And the other children watched her with a quiet reverence, not out of admiration, but fear. Fear of what had been done to her in that dark space beneath the kitchen stairs, where light refused to enter and voices did not echo, but stayed trapped in the cold, damp air, circling endlessly like moths that had forgotten the sun. And since Thomas's death, the man no longer spoke of education or discipline or preparation. Now he used the word transformation, and he said it without irony, without pause, as though it were sacred, as though it were something holy, and the children began to repeat it in whispers, not because they believed, but because their mouths needed to form the word to survive the sound of it. And it was then that they realized they had stopped speaking of Thomas altogether, not out of mourning, but because the sound of his name seemed to summon something. Not a memory, but a presence, a weight in the air that turned warmth into ice and breath into silence. And one night Samuel tried to say it aloud, to say Thomas Brennan with his full name, but his throat tightened and his vision blurred, and before he could finish the second syllable his nose began to bleed, slow and thick, as if something inside him had cracked under pressure. And after that he never tried again, and neither did the others. And the man began keeping candles lit even in daylight, candles made from fat that smelled wrong when burned, too rich, too heavy, and the light they cast was dim and flickering, like fire that had no source. And under that light he read to them from the Black Book, not every day but often, passages that made no grammatical sense, but still settled into their minds like roots. Passages like suffering clarifies the self by removing excess, or joy is a byproduct of misunderstanding. And the children would sit still and listen, because to look away was to invite punishment. And punishment had changed. It was no longer the cellar or the courtyard or missed meals. It was something deeper, something worse. It was called reflection, and it meant being forced to sit in front of the cracked mirror in the infirmary for hours, staring into your own eyes, while the man read from the Black Book behind you, never touching you, never raising his voice, just reading. And slowly the children learned what he meant by transformation, because when the reflection was over, the one who returned to the dormitory was never quite the same, quieter, duller, their voice softer, their steps more hesitant, and their sleep deeper, almost too deep. And it was during one of these reflections that the girl named Abigail, age 9, fell asleep with her eyes open and did not wake up. Her chest rose and fell, but her eyes remained locked on the ceiling, unblinking, unseeing. And she remained like that for 3 days before her breathing stopped, and the man wrote in his journal subject, "A shows signs of mental departure preceding physical expiration, a promising outcome," and he marked it with a symbol instead of a number. A shape that none of the children recognized but all feared, a circle within a square within a triangle. And when Samuel tried to redraw it from memory, that night his hand would not stop shaking, and the coal snapped in his fingers, and the next morning he was unable to speak for almost 10 hours. And during those hours he claimed later to have seen something in the shadows of the laundry room, not a figure but a suggestion of one. like the memory of a person who had never lived, and had watched him and smiled without a mouth. And he knew then that transformation was not just psychological. It was spiritual, or worse, it was something beyond both, something older. And it was feeding on their fear, like bread, slowly, methodically. And when Emma began to hum to herself during meals, the others did not stop her, even though the song was tuneless and endless. Even though she never blinked while humming, they let her continue, because it was a sound that was not the man's voice, and that made it precious. And yet even that comfort was short-lived, because one night she changed the melody and began humming in time with the rhythm of his footsteps. And that was when they knew he had entered her mind, or perhaps something else had. And then the real horror revealed itself, not in a scream, not in a death, but in obedience, in the way the children began punishing each other before he had to, correcting posture, monitoring speech, offering up those who cried at night as examples of weakness, not out of malice, but survival. And he rewarded this behavior with praise, not with words of kindness, but with nods and touches on the shoulder. Brief and clinical, but more valuable than food, more powerful than warmth. And Samuel once said aloud, "We are being taught to enforce our own captivity." And Mary simply nodded and whispered yes, but no one can stop, because we've already started becoming him. And in the weeks that followed, they began having the same dreams, or if not the same, then overlapping. Dreams of a staircase that descended beyond the foundation of the house into a space with walls made of bone and floors made of ash. Dreams where they stood in a circle around a shape that was always moving but never changed. And they would wake up gasping, not because the dream had frightened them, but because waking meant remembering it wasn't a dream. And Abigail's body was not buried, not burned, not even removed, but placed in the sanctum. And though none of them saw it happen, they all felt it, like the closing of a door they didn't know had been opened. And from that night, on the walls of the dormitory began to sweat in the corners, and the floorboards sometimes pulsed beneath their feet like breathing. And the man began referring to the house not as Riverside, but as the structure. And in his readings from the Black Book, he used new phrases like thresholds of capacity and emotional calcification. And though the words meant little, their weight was undeniable. And one night Mary whispered into Samuel's ear and asked the question that had been forming in all their minds. The question no one dared speak aloud until then. She asked, "What if we are not the experiment, but the offering?" And Samuel had no answer, only silence, the same silence that lived now in every hallway, in every meal, in every flickering candle. And even in the dark behind the man's eyes where something else watched through him, something that had waited a long time for children like them, children who could be emptied and filled again with a new purpose, a darker one, a purpose born, not of survival, but of obedience to something they could not name, could not understand, and yet could no longer resist. Shall I continue into section 10, where labor is not survival, but devotion, and the sanctum breathes? They no longer questioned the weight of their own hands, nor the silence that grew between their thoughts, nor the shadows that moved along the stone walls, though no light shifted to cause them. And when the sun rose, they did not cheer, and when it set, they did not mourn, because the rhythm of time had become irrelevant, and the measure of progress was no longer survival, but compliance, and the work began before dawn, and ended only when the man said it would. And even then there was no rest, only stillness, and that stillness was not peace. It was obedience, and the children were now tools of something they could not name, and yet had begun to feel in their bones like a chill that never left. And every morning they were assigned tasks, but these were not chores, not duties of cleanliness or care. They were rituals of transformation. And the labor was not for maintenance, it was for devotion, and they chopped wood, not to burn, but to stack in patterns they did not understand, and they hauled water not to drink, but to pour down the same hollow in the earth that had appeared one. morning without warning behind the structure near the tree line, where no tree had ever grown, and the man called this place the sanctum, and when they asked what it was, he only smiled and said, "It is what you are becoming," and they understood without understanding, because the truth had already begun to grow inside them, like roots, like mold, like hunger, and Emma, who once hummed without tune, now hummed in perfect rhythm with the wind, even when there was no wind, and Samuel no longer spoke without permission, and when he did, his voice was lower, steadier, not because of fear, but because of some deeper submission, some final surrender to the shape he had been carved into. And Mary did not sleep anymore, not out of anxiety or terror, but because her dreams had moved into the waking world, and there was no longer a line between what was real and what was commanded. And when the man brought them to the courtyard one morning and said the words, "Initiation through purpose begins," now they did not run, they did not cry, they did not question, because the part of them that could resist had been broken and remade, and inside the sanctum they were shown something, not a relic, not a figure, not even an idea, but a feeling, a force, a weight that pressed down upon the lungs and bent the spine and made the heart beat faster and slower at the same time. And it was beautiful in the way that fire is beautiful when it consumes everything and leaves only ash. And the man knelt before it, and the children followed. And when he said, "Speak your purpose," they spoke, and their voices were not their own, and their words were not in any language they had ever learned, and the walls seemed to hear them and answer in a tone too low for the ears, but felt in the blood. And the next morning 10 were gone, not dead, not missing, simply absent from all memory and record. And the man said the offering had been accepted, and the structure was complete, and from that day forward there were no more punishments, only silence, only rituals, only work. And the man did not age, and the children did not die, and no one came, and no one left, and the world forgot, because forgetting was safer. And in 1987, when the documents were found, when the workers touched the wrong stone and opened the wrong door, something exhaled, and the walls wept, and the light in the room dimmed for no reason, and one man whispered, I heard them sing," and he walked into the forest that night, barefoot and smiling, and he was never seen again, and the documents were sealed, and the workers paid, and no news ever reported what was found, and the sanctum waits, and the niece structure remains, and the children, if they ever truly were children, still speak in dreams. And sometimes, when the wind is wrong, and the sky turns that particular shade of iron, if you listen very closely near the river, just northwest of Springfield, you might hear something that should not exist, something that was once called Riverside, but is now only known by those who were changed by it, who were emptied, who were prepared, who were offered, and who now wait for the next voice to answer the call of the sanctum. The river froze again that year, though it was midsummer, and the birds that once sang near the old limestone walls no longer approached the trees, and the air itself seemed reluctant to move, as if afraid to stir the silence that now lived in there. Ground and deep beneath that silence lay what had once been a place of refuge, a place of mercy and childhood and memory, but now was only the sanctum, and those who passed too near it felt it without seeing it, a weight pressing on their chests, a chill crawling down their spine. And though nothing remained above ground, no building, no sign, no stone to mark the site, the presence was not gone, only buried, only waiting, and the few who read the journals, those forgotten pages stained with grease and blood and salt, never spoke of what they found, because the words would not form in their mouths, and the sounds they tried to make would twist into other shapes, shapes not meant for human voices. And the state sealed the area and called it a protected wetland, and issued maps with blank space where the forest grew too thick for the satellites to see, and the story became legend, and the legend became warning, and still some returned, drawn by dreams, by whispers, by the promise of understanding what had never been understood, and they brought cameras and recorders and sacred books and charms, but nothing worked, because the sanctum did not repel it consumed, and in every generation. There were a few who heard it not as a voice, but as a feeling, like remembering something that never happened, and for them the structure lived again, in thought, in echo, in impulse, and they found each other in hidden places in dark corners of the world, and they spoke the words again, not knowing their meaning, only knowing their power, and in their eyes the same hollowness that once lived in Mary Patterson, in Samuel Harrison, in Emma Caldwell, and in the 10 who survived by surrendering everything they had once been, and the circle completes and completes again, and the offering is never finished, because it was never about death. It was about breaking the world just enough to let something else in, and every time someone dreams of a cold room, and a man reading from a book with no title, the sanctum stirs, and the forgotten tragedy becomes memory again, and the children cry out not for help, but for return, for obedience, for continuation, because their innocence was not stolen, it was repurposed. And the man was not a monster, he was only the first. And now the work begins again.